Welcome everyone to this video on Java counted loops, more commonly known as for loops. So to begin this lesson, what we're going to look at is known as the counted loop, or the for loop in many more circumstances that you'll see further on. The reason they're known for this is because the for loops or counted loops purpose is to run something a specific amount of times at the beginning of the for loop. So in other words, what this means is that when you originally start your loop, you know your purpose is to run that loop 5 times. If you know it's going to run 10 times or 25 times, the point is you know the amount of times it's going to run when you first begin the loop. So unlike our while loops, which we're going to look at first, where I'm going to create a while loop that will look exactly and function the same way as a for loop. However, it would be better implemented as a for loop because it is easier to read. Okay, so here's a while loop version of a for loop. I'm going to create a variable named num, which is an integer. I'm going to give it a value of 0. Then I'm going to create my while loop structure. As normal, I'm going to say inside my condition, I'm going to make it something such as num is less than 5. I'm going to put a body of the code where I'm going to print out the word hello. And then I'm going to have a step which is going to make sure that it's going to increment num's value by 1 each time I go through my loop, so that eventually num will be equal or greater than 5, my condition will be false, and I will continue on. Now if I were to do this and look at this logically, I know that my loop will run when num's value is 0, when it will go through, increase by 1, come back, then do it when it's 1, do the same thing, then come back and do it when it's 2, then when it's 3, and then when it's 4, and it will stop at 5. So this means that it will run 5 times for 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Moving forward from there, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a version of this where we can take this exact same loop, except we're going to make it a little bit more obvious and a little bit more condensed. And this is where we're going to use the for loop or the counted loop. So what we're going to start off with here is we are going to make it so that we have a for loop where we have our brackets. Inside this for loop, we're going to have 3 different pieces. We're going to have the initialization statement, which if you think back to our while loop, we initialized a variable named num and gave it a value of 0. This is the same step that we're going to do in our for loop. The next part, after our semicolon inside our brackets, is going to be our conditional statement. All similar to our while loop has one as well. It was num is less than 5. And then finally, the last thing we're going to have is our increment statement or increment step. This was the step that makes it towards a point where our loop will end. In the case of our while loop, this was num++. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same things here, but we're going to put it inside of a for loop instead. So I'm going to create a for loop structure. My initialization statement will be int I equals 0. My conditional statement will be as long as I is less than 5, I want to continue my loop. And my increment step is going to be I++, just like it was num++ before. So you'll notice that all of these link up with something that was used previously in my while loop. This is how I know it will run 5 times. So inside the body of it, remember I'm going to have my initialization step, which happens only the first time through. So this is an important distinction to understand for for loops. This part will only run on the first iteration of the for loop. When I say iteration, I am referring to each time we go through the loop. The first time through the loop is our first iteration. The second is our second iteration. The 5th time through is our 5th iteration. Make sure that you understand this step only happens on the first run of the loop. It will not run on any of the rest of them. My conditional statement and iteration statements will both happen every single time I go through my loop. Second thing to understand is that the iteration step happens at the last part of the loop. This happens after the entire body and will wait until the very, very bottom, and it will come back, and before it checks the condition, it will apply the iteration step, which will then increase the value of I, making it closer to 5 and making our condition slowly becoming closer to being false. So now inside of the curly brackets, I'm going to put my body of my code. So I'm going to say system.out.println by. So I'm going to print that out every single time my code runs. So now keep in mind, I have my while loop up here, which should run hello 5 times, but I also have my for loop down here, which should run by 5 times. And if you look at them, I have 5 hellos and I have 5 buys. Now the difference here is that on my while loop, I could have combined these two, so this would be 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code. If I look at my for loop, I have 1 line of code, 2 lines of code. This is why we use for loops, because they're easier to read and they make more sense to read as a person who is coding or reading somebody else's code. It also makes more sense because it means that you know before you begin the implementation of the code exactly where it's going to go. With a while loop, that does not always happen. Sometimes with a while loop, the conditions will sometimes increase, sometimes decrease. Things are not consistent, and that's when you want to use a while loop. Okay? A couple extra things we're going to note about for loops that you have to remember when we're moving forward. Please keep in mind that the I value inside the for loop only exists inside of the for loop. This means that it is what we call a local variable. It does not exist outside the for loop, and once you're outside of it, if you try to reference I, you will not get a value from it since it no longer exists. Second thing to remember is that for loops are to be done when you know how many times you are going to run something. This is, of course, that you have to understand this is referring to when the loop is created, do you know how many times this will run? This may be determined by something you got from the user and input. This does not mean that before you start your code you already know. This just means that maybe the user inputs 5, this means you know you run 5 times. If the user inputs 10, maybe you know it runs 10 times now. The idea is that you have some way for sure knowing how many times your loop will run. In most cases, you will start your for loops at 0 and go to a point at which I is less than the amount of times you want to run your loop. This is how you will know for sure how many times it's going to run. Please keep in mind also the increment step does not always have to increase by 1. It can increase by 2, it can multiply by 2, it can do all sorts of things. The point is that this is what will be applied at the end of every iteration. And last but not least, please remember that while loops are more commonly used when we don't know how many times we want our code to run before we begin the loop. This means that things may change throughout the course of the while loop, such as things like user input, or maybe you have numbers that react differently based on odd numbers and even numbers, etc. The point is, it's when we don't have such a linear approach to our code, we want to use a while loop.